Brandon usually collaborates with someone who brings a strength to the project. That's a deep Easter egg that's not necessary. You know, I'm a nerd about all things music, so I don't think we are as enamored of forgiveness as a society as we used to be, certainly as we should be.
Peter, I'm actually going to start by ambushing you with a question that wasn't on the list of questions that I sent you through before, but it's been on my mind for days. I think that you have the coolest name in all of fantasy. Where does the name Orullian come from? I'm curious.
It's Armenian. A lot of times if you hear a surname ending in Ian, it's a good bet it could be Armenian.
Peter, we're here today to talk about your book that's coming out, Songs of the Dead. For people who may be discovering you through Songs of the Dead, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, as a creative, I've always had this sort of dual path of music and storytelling ever since I was a kid. Whenever I'm writing fiction, I would say 98% of the time music is a significant factor, whether it's a music magic system or stories about musicians or a culture that pivots on music. And then with my music, these days, almost everything I write is narrative-based, storytelling. So I write albums, concept albums that I can also novelize, that when we tour the production, it's sort of a start to finish or curtain to curtain show that tells a story. And it's just, it's not that it happens all organically. And so, you know, if you don't know me and you come to either of my creative pursuits, you'll find it's always blended.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating combination, I think. I'm going to quote you from the book, an early point in the book. You're writing through the main character, Jack. There's a couple of lines, a few pages in, where you say, songwriting was storytelling. So reading decent books helped with narrative techniques. I'd found words had a kind of music of their own. Now that kind of, to me, it speaks to what you were just saying about those two lines of your creativity coming together in the music and the writing.
You know, I think the best songs usually do tell a story. With lyric-based music, that's part of the emotional center of those songs. And so from my earliest childhood, singing, you know, my mom would stand me up on the piano bench and I would sing at family parties and Christmas gatherings and things of that nature. And usually the songs, at least the ones that resonated the most, were telling some kind of story. Much more figurative, of course, with lyrics, because you only have so much time and space to deliver the story. So I sort of was attuned to that very early on. And then as a kid, I wasn't putting pen to paper, but I was telling extemporaneous stories to my little sister. At bedtime, we shared a room, and so I would tell her stories that just kind of make them up on the fly. Those two things just were always coming out of me. You know, I was always humming and singing, even in church, you know, not at the right times, and I had to be hushed many times because, you know, I'm not even aware sometimes that I'm singing. My wife tells me this all the time. My brain's wired that way. When I'm in the supermarket, I'm listening to what we call muzak, you know, that sometimes very awful music they play at the supermarket. It's so funny, man. I'll be walking away from the supermarket and still humming those songs. You know, very often they're like really, really diluted versions of popular songs that we've heard on the radio in yesteryear. I'm listening to that and I'm hearing the song and trying to identify it. I have this brain, there's got to be a term for it, a scientific term for it, but I can hear songs and music sort of in full fidelity in my mind. I can hear all of the parts and all of the instrumentation. And so I have this like radio in my head whenever I need it. When I'm in the car and I'm driving and listening to a song and I have to park and come in for dinner, or even if I've been away from my car for several days, when I get back in the car, I begin to sing the song at its place where I left it before I even turn the car on. And so, you know, my CD starts up and it's kind of uncanny. It surprises me every time. But there's just something in my brain that, I don't know, participates in music in this very unique way. And, you know, I'm very glad of that, because I think it creates opportunities in storytelling that I enjoy. So they've been inextricable for as long as I can remember. I guess I wouldn't have it any other way. When I'm writing, I'm happiest when music sort of pervades the tale, which is why Songs of the Dead was so much fun to write. But all of the fiction, you know, I've been lucky enough to novelize big concept albums from some of my favorite metal bands, and that was sheer joy. I mean, for some writers, getting to say do a tie-in novel for Star Wars or Star Trek or something might be the height of sort of work for hire. For me, working, you know, with musicians that I admire and music that I love to create a story out of these concept albums was my Star Wars. It seems as though whenever I am engaged in one of these activities, these creative activities, the other is always presenting itself. The combination is just, I think, very, very potent. And so I'm glad that that's the junction at which I work creatively, because I think the opportunity to invest the reader or the listener is higher when you can pull that off and do it well.
It's funny you should mention about, you know, humming along to music, or maybe when you don't even realize, because I'm sure there's a moment in the book too, right, where Jack talks about he actually hums along to music while he's reading books, and it helps him focus on what he's writing. So that must be something that you've put straight from yourself into your main character, Jack.
I do that. I've always found words to be musical. And certainly some writers do a better job of placing language in a way that feels lyrical, feels musical. One of my favorites that does that is Ray Bradbury. His prose is just so lyrical. But I think music is that way. Shakespeare was that way for me. There's a cadence and a beauty to it that is musical to me. And there's times when I'm, writing, when I take time and effort to try and make my, prose work the same way. For instance, there's a scene in the book where Jack is auditioning at Wembley Stadium, effectively for the band that kicked him out. It's a very powerful emotional scene. I kind of got in a headspace where I wanted this to feel musical, even as the art and the form kind of mirror one another. I wanted people to feel the music as much as sort of read about it, and language can do that for sure. And there are techniques for that, but I also think there's a certain innate gift some writers have for creating that. And many of my readers have told me that a lot of my language feels that way, and so I'm happy about that, because I certainly enjoy writers that give me that same sense.
It's really fun to see how you've incorporated so many real life music references throughout the book. If I was to ask you, what is a band or a song that you feel might most represent you as an author or your style as a writer?
I think, there's one song that I would say typifies how I feel as a creator. And it's from the band I mentioned before, Dream Theater. It's the title is A Change of Seasons. It's an epic tune. It's about 23 minutes long, and the basic story is this movement through mortality, the seasons of life, and sort of this move from innocence to experience and to acceptance of mortality, and how one does that or can do that. As you might imagine, the movement in the music moves from frenetic at times, as life is, to very spare and emotional and raw. And so it has this ebb and flow, the same way life does, but with an ultimate hopefulness, even out of sort of the darkest winter. As a creator, I feel that way. I think we, if we're doing a good job of our storytelling, we're giving the reader that same journey, those dark moments, those moments of bright hope, and the one sort of illuminates the other. And it's definitely an effort I make in my fiction. I'm old enough to want from my books not just to thrill the reader, but to edify the reader, because those are the stories I like. And Change of Seasons is that kind of an experience for me musically. So that might be the one I would choose. I had met Brandon at a a writers conference in Provo, Utah called LTUE. Inevitably, we ended up on some fiction panels together. Brandon, of course, had this amazing career trajectory already underway. I had an epic fantasy trilogy with Tor books. Brandon started Stormlight Archive. He'd done The Wheel of Time. So I was looking for a way to move to the next level in my career. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. Of course, sometimes you just get lucky and you write a book that kind of goes viral. I had the idea that if I collaborated with a writer who maybe already had an audience, it could, present me to more readers. And so I because I knew Brandon and we were friends, I sent him an email, and I was delighted, unexpectedly, that he accepted. And he had a project called Death by Pizza. We hadn't quite gotten it right. It had to do with this American metal singer living in London who gets killed delivering a pizza and wakes up to a new reality where he has some magical abilities. Part of the reason he was struggling with it is that he understood intellectually that the rock and metal culture was often stereotyped. So when I had approached him, he had read some of my books and blurbed them. He knew I was a musician and that I'd been a part of this community as a touring musician, recording musician. And so it made a lot of sense to do the collaboration, because Brandon usually collaborates with someone who brings a strength to the project that he might not himself have. So, it was a good fit. We decided to do it. It was still a journey to get to the point where we got the book coming out next week, because, he has, anybody who knows Brandon, he has so many projects, so much going on. And in the meantime, I had some fairly sizable projects of my own, both on the writing side, working with some big groups, some Grammy award-winning groups to write the books to their records, but also my music. I wrote and recorded an album, and we did some touring. So with all of those things, it took some time, but we finally got the book done and sold the trilogy. And Songs of the Dead is the first in the Strata Wars, which is the series name that releases next week.
I'm really interested in the perspective of what a collaborative project like that looks like. What's something you think that fans and readers might assume about a co-writing project like that you think might not be accurate?
Collaborators, I know, do this in different ways. I believe Stephen King and Peter Straub, when they wrote The Talisman, did it chapter by chapter.
So one author would write one chapter, the next would write the next. Oh, wow, that's interesting.
And I'm sure they had conversations about where they were headed. But that's, it's one approach. The other is, sometimes the James Patterson approach, right? He may have a seed of an idea, and then basically the other writer just does all the work, and James Patterson's brand goes on it. Brandon wanted a truly collaborative relationship. Obviously, he was in a position where he could dictate if that's what he wanted to do, but he didn't want that. He wanted it to be a real collaboration. So once we decided we were going to go forward, he did a first draft of a World Bible, sent it over to me. I began adding things and asking questions about stuff he had, and we would refine things, and it grew, and then some things we would cut and change, and that process went on for a number of weeks. So it was a lot of work, collaborative work, just kind of getting the framework in place. This happened in email and a lot of exchanges, sharing documents and stuff. And then once that was all finished, I took that initial outline and I began to do the line-by-line writing. And then those weekly story calls became opportunities to triage story questions that would arrive in the writing that maybe we hadn't anticipated. And Brandon was really great in those, because, if I had an instinct to go one way and he had an instinct to go another way, he'd say, well, I might try and solve it this way. And usually what happened is, after some conversation, we'd find a third approach that we liked better than either of the things we were talking about. It was really very, very equitable. And that might surprise people, because, Brandon very easily could have done the James Patterson thing, because he's at that altitude in his career. But it wasn't. It was, he really wanted my investment in it and co-create with me. I think what might surprise people is it was a very collaborative process. Brandon really wanted investment, as a co-creator from my side. It reads, I think, more with my voice because I did the line-by-line writing. But, people might assume from that Brandon wasn't participatory in the process of creating the book, and that would be a mistake.
You said that you and Brandon have been friends and had a working relationship for some time. Were you surprised by that collaborative attitude?
I don't think so, because I'd known Brandon for a long time. He's a very gracious person, and very forthcoming, very transparent. Always that way. And so I'd known him long enough that when he wanted to do it this way, it didn't surprise me. And more than that, at the very outset, when he called me after I had sent him the email just proposing the idea, and it was one of the first things he said is that that was the approach he wanted to take. He didn't want it to be a disproportionate sort of like a seniority thing on his side. And so he set the tone for it from the very beginning. I was happy about that, but I wasn't genuinely surprised, only because I knew Brandon well enough that it was in character.
Without spoiling anything in the book, obviously, were there any kind of story decisions where you think you and Brandon initially may have seen things differently?
I remember in the draft, I had a character, he was a reporter. Brandon didn't like this character very much. And so I definitely cut the character. So what happened was this seed of that idea from that journalist that was a character that Brandon didn't like and was easy to cut, right? It wasn't material to the story. Ended up evolving into a rather central part of this whole series, which is this war between the present and the past. It helped in the final revision. It helped me to sort of materialize this idea that the topside world, our current world, through its neglect or marginalization or revision of the past, the stories of the lives of the people who have gone before, is compromising their ability to evolve, to advance to whatever next existence might be available to a soul. So they're angry, right? They're revolting. They need to address this behavior of the topside world for self-preservation. That all came from that character. So while we cut him, and it was definitely, it didn't hurt my feelings because the character wasn't precious to me. It did actually establish the root of the idea that I think ended up making the series more meaningful, because it gave a tenable reason for the past to want to create revolution against the present. Yeah, so that's a longer answer than you were looking for, but...
Yeah, great answer. You touched on it a little bit in there when you talked about you did a lot of the line-by-line writing of this. I wondered, what parts, in your opinion, of Songs of the Dead feel more like Peter, and which parts do you think feel more like Brandon? One
of the things in the World Bible was the magic system, and this idea of catalysts. In order to apply their trade, the Thanatists have tools of the trade. And so that whole idea with the Kopesh knives and the lantern and bow, those were all like a really, really unique magic system. Now, I can't pretend that I read every fantasy book that gets published, but it certainly felt really unique to me. I think when people come to it and they start to experience the magic system, they'll be like, oh, of course, yeah, Brandon's come up with yet another really cool, unique approach at magic. What was also cool for me is that Brandon had this framework, and at the time it was principally just necromancy. Beyond that, there were other pillars to the magic system that evolved as the writing went on. So, Brandon presented this great framework, and then I was able to populate it with some additional ideas. We always knew that there'd be music of some kind, but not what that would look like. So the music part of the magic system is something I invented. There's a layer of the magic system called shadowmancy that has to do with reading inside the shadow and what you can see there and what it looks like and how you can understand something about the person from that. That's all invention that I brought to the magic system. So I think, that the readers will, see that this framework that Brandon created it's a Sanderson framework. It's very inventive. And then I think they'll see a bunch of the stuff that I brought to that magic system. There's so much music woven into the book. Certainly there's some theoretical elements. They're basic enough that most people can understand them. You don't have to be a musician or like rock and metal to enjoy the book. In fact, we were deliberate not to create any barriers in that regard. We didn't want people to bounce off the story because they don't know anything about this music. In fact, the contrary, Brandon's like, I would love for people to, as a consequence, feel differently about it, not lean into the stereotype, but, see these people as the people that they are, in the same way that fantasy and science fiction people get stereotyped. But obviously we're humans with, problems and dreams, just like every other human. That's one of the things I brought to the book. These people who share this passion for this music are likable and flawed. And then there's certainly a lot of music that is referenced, but never in a way that you have to have special knowledge to understand what's going on. One thing that sometimes fans don't understand is in the world of music, if you use lyrics in a book, the rights clearances are really, really tough. So usually you don't do it just to avoid the trouble. So we didn't use lyrics. When I would include a song reference, those were always deliberately chosen, which is to say that if someone were interested enough to go and read the lyrics from those songs, they would understand the reason the song was chosen. It was hard sometimes not to want to use some of the lyrics because they would have done such a great job of, explicating the context for which the song was chosen.
Well, I love that idea of if you pay attention and you do that extra little bit of homework outside of the book, it's going to change the way that you read it in a way. Now I'm going to have to start the book again and go through and Google every single song that comes up and read the lyrics.
Yes, it would be an interesting way to read the book, to have like your device there, and every time a song came up, you Google the lyrics, because if you read the lyrics on a lot of those songs, you're like, oh man, of course this is the song that was used here. And that's a deep Easter egg that's not necessary. It's really not. But I'm a nerd about all things music, so I took a lot of care in my choices.
Is there a connection there between the songs that you chose for the Songs of the Dead playlist? I've seen your videos about the playlist and the songs that represent the book.
Yeah, the songs in the Songs of the Dead playlist, which I'm still building. It's only up to 35, and there's far more music referenced in the book. They're songs that were referenced in the book. It's a very diverse list. It's got groups that everybody will know by name, even if they don't listen to the music. And it's got some groups that even fairly serious musicians who like the genre may not have heard of. It would delight me if people found some groups that they thought were cool. There's definitely be some groups that are not people's tastes. I mentioned bands like Cannibal Corpse and Meshuggah. Those bands are extreme metal bands, and they are not everybody's taste. There's a really funny moment where they're being surrounded by a bunch of semblances and other people. They're boxing them in, and Jack asks Chewie, hey, do you still have your Bluetooth speaker? Chewie's this audio engineer, and he has this amazing Bluetooth speaker that just pushes like so much wattage. Chewie's response is D minor the saddest of all keys. Now, people who know Spinal Tap will remember that from Spinal Tap. If you don't need to know that, you understand what Chewie's saying, like he's saying, of course. And then he gets out the Bluetooth and they put on Hammer Smashed Face, which is a track by Cannibal Corpse. That's just this really aggressive tune, and it would sound like hell is coming to someone who's never heard it, right? If you're talking about somebody who's down in the strata that lived hundreds of years ago, it would sound so foreign, and it would just sound like hell. So anyway, the point is that the playlist is very diverse. Jack is a student of history and a student of music history, so everything in the book is not all about rock and metal.
Been reading the book obviously for the past few days. And I was actually in London today, between sites at work. I was in the Soho area around Carnaby Street and that kind of thing. And because I've been reading the book, I've been picturing all the narrow streets that Jack and Henry may have walked down and things like that. I think it's really interesting, kind of deep knowledge of London, really. What's the connection there? You must have spent some time in London.
When I worked at Xbox, we had offices both in London and in Reading. And I would get over there. Maybe
Reading's my hometown.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, born and raised.
Oh, yeah. See, we had offices in Reading. I think it was because it was cheaper to have offices in Reading than downtown London. Not every year, but maybe every other year I got to London. And I love that city. I just adore that city. And so I just do walkabouts and just go walking around. But I also did a fair amount of navigating through the streets with Google Earth. That was a way that I found certain locations. So I became much more conversant with the city in writing the book than I was even in traveling there. But I adore the city. It's a city with such great, deep history. And so it made the perfect location for this first trilogy. You know, the other reason for London is, of course, it's really the birthplace of metal, with Sabbath and Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. I mean, there's arguments about who was really first, but those three really, I think, sort of launched the genre. Yeah, so that was the other reason for London.
What is different about the Peter who finished this book compared to the Peter that started this book?
I'm a student of the craft more now than I have ever been. Just from a craft perspective, I think I upped my game in story architecture because I rewrote this book a couple of times. I was always, working at having structure help propel the story. So as a writer, I think that, I gain ground, hopefully, in certain elements of the craft. One of the things that became evident to me in this time period of writing is I'm very enamored of books, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that have maybe not the purpose, but the effect of not just sort of thrilling the reader, but edifying the reader. I think there's certain things about life here, and maybe this is a reflection of my age, but I don't think we are as enamored of forgiveness as a society as we used to be, certainly as we should be. And one of the things that's present in this book is the ward who Jack is trying to bond with in order to help save London and save the Iron Horse and save his friends, tells him he kind of needs to be on what she calls the forgiving path. A lot of the stories I'm writing now, they tend to have some sort of center that is about not just interior growth in the way most books should have them, like the character changes. There's some effect of that change that is for not just themselves, but for, the people around them. I adore those kinds of stories. I grew up, I'm a huge Christmas nerd, and I love everything about Christmas, but the stories that resonate are stories like certainly A Christmas Carol. These stories about these people who put themselves, they subjugate their own interests in service of others. I love those kinds of stories, people who stand in the breach for someone else, and those don't have to be battles. I think I've said this before, but the father who works a thankless job that they probably hate because they have a commitment to a spouse and children that need them to do that. I think there's nothing finer. I mean, that person, that father stepping into the breach. Now, of course, a mother can do the same thing. My point is just there's something beautiful and decent and wonderful about people doing that. And I love stories that can thrill. Like there's all of the stuff in the macro, in the external arc that's going on that can excite you and get you turning the pages. But when you're finished, I think the thing that stays with you is the characters and the choices they make. And so when characters make those kind of choices, that's the stuff I really live for. Battles come and go, but people being decent and exhibiting the finer qualities. And I know this sounds very maudlin, but I'm just kind of at a point where those are the stories I want to write. And frankly, the stories I want to read too. There's so many books in the world. I mean, you get to the point where like, how many more books can I write and read in my life? So you have to make choices. So I think that's the difference in me that I've kind of come to in the past few years is just like where's my energy going to go? It's going to be in trying to tell those kinds of stories more. And with the future Strata Wars stories, obviously there's going to be major battles and cool magic and some cool monsters. I mean, all of that's the trappings of the genre that we adore, still there, but they won't be there without this emotional core, because that matters to me probably more than the rest of the stuff. Jack in this story has a very, very traumatic childhood, and for all intents and purposes, he doesn't have that family anymore, and that's a true condition for a lot of folks. And Jack finds this family inside this metal community. It's something he, I think, understands intellectually when the book opens, but not emotionally. I think that idea is a really powerful one. I think people in fantasy and science fiction understand this to a degree, because I think very often they are on one side of being marginalized as different, or the nerds, or what have you, even by the media, without the substance of the beauty that's inside this community, people who, root for one another and support one another. And that's what I think the big message is for Jack. And at the end of this book, this idea of people who will stand up for you in your moment of need, and being that same kind of person for those, those same friends. I just love that idea. And so it is the culmination at the end of the book. And hopefully that's a hopeful note that people take away after they've finished the story.
Peter, thank you so very much for your time. It's been a real delight to talk to you. Songs of the Dead is out on June 16th. It's available in the UK in Waterstones and the Broken Binding. I am really enjoying the book, and I hope that many other people get to enjoy it as well. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.